Bonjour my lovelies, how are you doing today? As you already know, my name is Adriel, and today we are going to be talking about what it's like to date in France versus the United States. Now obviously, as an American, my dating experience is based upon the US, and so that's really all I can compare the experience of dating in France to. I will also note that I met my boyfriend probably pretty on after moving here. I met him in December of 2020. I moved here in March of 2020 and was immediately locked down as part of COVID. So it was really interesting when I kind of came out of COVID. That's when I started dating. Not when I came out of COVID, but when we came out of lockdown, that's when I started dating. And I really had like a very short window to like meet someone before they locked us down again. So I ended up meeting my current boyfriend, who is Julian, also known as Juju, and I have videos on him. He's cute. And I want to apologize now. I do have a cold, so please bear with me, but I think that you will enjoy this. So let's get into it. So first things first, one of the biggest differences I think that exists between dating in France versus dating in the US is that the men want to partner up so quickly. Like, you don't have to wait, ladies. They wanna partner up now. Basically, one of the really unique things about dating in France is that after essentially you kiss, after maybe one or two dates, you are considered in a relationship. Like, you are in a relationship. So it's not like in the US where you're dating multiple people at one time. No. By like date number 2, you are in a relationship with that person. So it's very focused. It's a very like short period of time. That's why I don't know if you even call it, if I can really even say it's dating in France versus dating in America, because it's really like, what's the difference between being in a relationship in France versus like dating in America? So I have a friend and she ended up meeting her husband actually on Tinder. I met Juju, interestingly enough, on Tinder, and she met her husband on Tinder, and they went out on their first date, and he said, "Yep, you're the one. I want to marry you." I'm like, good. And she was like, whoa. She's an American. She was like, I need a bit more moment. I need some time. I gotta think about this. It was just one date. And literally by like date number 4, he was like, it's taking you a really long time to make a decision because I want to marry you. And, I can't wait forever. And I think it was after 2 months, he was like, come on, like, let's like, haven't you made your decision yet? Like, what could possibly be taking you so long? And they did get married, and they've now been happily married for, 5+ years, and they're very happy together. And I want to note, I do think this happens in the US. I just think that in the US, there are so many more games, right? Like, I think that people, men and women, are both like, oh, something better might come along. And I think that kind of like hinders and messes up dating somewhat. I also think that the French system is frankly what existed in many ways for our parents, right? Because you met somebody, you liked them, you dated them, you married them, right? Like that's how it progressed. Whereas now we have like all of these, tools, and, we basically use it to like date ourselves into exhaustion. Whereas the French, they use the tools, but they use the tools to like meet somebody and be like, great, okay, wonderful, we're in a relationship. That's what they want. So that I think is a big cultural difference compared to the US. Now, one thing I will say is that one of the downsides to this is that you're not entirely certain if it's real, right? It can be fickle, right? Because when you do have a culture that is so accustomed to just instantly being in a relationship, there may not necessarily be a lot of processing time as to whether or not you are the person that is someone that they want to be in a relationship with. Whereas if you went on, 10 dates, for example, instead of just, the 2, and before you get in the relationship, you might have a little bit more, clarity as to whether or not this is somebody you really want to be in a relationship with. Now, one of the things I would also say is very different between dating in the US versus dating in France would be that gender roles are less defined here. And when I say that, I mean that the traditional gender roles that I think exist in the US are very much less traditionally kind of recognized or kind of part of dating in France. So, for example, I have seen a lot less toxic masculinity in France than the US. A lot less of that, oh, well, I'm the man, so I have to make the most money, and I have to do this and that, and I'm in charge of the household, and my wife answers to me. Like, a lot of that stuff, I've seen a lot less of it here in France. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, it exists, right? This is not a perfect society by any means, and it does exist, but there is substantially less than that. So, for example, you know, Juju always brags like about the fact of like how successful I am. And when I was in the US, the fact that I was a lawyer was something that was very intimidating to most men. You know, they found out that I was a lawyer and it would be like, oh, well, you know, do you even really need me? It's like, okay. And, you know, it would be questions about how much money I made, you know, and kind of, you know, them feeling like, oh, well, because I have my act together, that somehow meant that they didn't need me. And with Julian, I never ever felt that way. He never did that. He never, you know, has ever made comments about, oh, well, you make more, anything like that. Like, it doesn't exist, which is nice. And I appreciate that. It makes me feel more free and more comfortable in who I am, and not like I have to diminish or minimize my star in order to be in a relationship. You also see things like men cooking a lot. Julian actually does most of the cooking in the household. So he cooks probably 70% of the time. I cook maybe 30% of the time. And yeah, Juju cooks. Juju loves to clean the apartment. Oh my gosh, Juju loved to clean the apartment. Juju and his cleaning of the apartment. Juju puts on some music. He sings while he cleans the apartment. It's a whole thing. He is just having himself a grand old time. And it's really cute because once we were having an argument and Juju said to me, you need someone who will take care of you. You need somebody who's going to make you dinner. You won't eat if you don't have me. And I thought to myself, I mean, there is some truth to that because I really am not the best at feeding myself consistently. With that being said, the downside is that I find myself arguing over things that I don't think I should have to argue over. From my perspective, as the man, it is your job to take out the trash, darling. It is not mine. I grew up in a household where that, like, my dad and my brothers took out the trash. Like, that is their responsibility. So there are moments when I'm like, dude, I'm not taking out that is your role, that is your job. And I think the thing is that that's one of those moments where it doesn't fully compute because there are just very few of these traditional gender roles that exist within French society. That works both ways though, right? So it works that way for men, but it also works that way for women. I also think that overall, it just results in a society that really struggles a lot less with some of these toxic masculine qualities. And so as a result, it just makes it, I think, it makes it easier to date. I will never forget, I was once at the French embassy in Washington, D.C., and I was there for some sort of event. And I ended up meeting this African-American woman, and she and I were talking, and she was talking about how she, you know, her husband is French. And I was like, oh, that's so cool, how'd you meet? And she said to me, she goes, oh, honey, French men love Black American women. And so what I did is every time I went to France, I would set up myself some dates in advance, and that's how I met my husband. I was just like, what? Living here in France, I do not feel unattractive as a Black woman. And I have to say that is something that I know is going to be very sad, but I always did feel very much undesirable as an African American woman in the US. And I have to say, living here in France, I don't feel that way. I have never felt that way. I've never felt like I am undesirable as an African American woman. I don't know if I can fully explain this. I don't know if I can fully articulate it other than to just say that I feel desirable here in a way that I did not feel when I was in the US. And that's great. Now, one of the things that I think is the biggest downside of dating in France is their views on exclusivity. So during confinement, I'll never forget, I read this news story about a man who was caught by the police, and he was caught out without his, justification. And they were like, "Sir, what are you doing?" And he's like, "I was sick of my wife. I had to go see my mistress." And you read that and you think that's funny. But the thing is that French society doesn't really have that much of an issue with, like, you're having a mistress, right? Or having a lover. So I have a French friend who said that she doesn't want to go to a French therapist because she knows of people who their therapist has told them, "Oh, well, you just each need to cheat. Each one of you needs to cheat, take a lover, and then the problems in your relationship will get better." That very much does exist in this society, in the sense that it really is acceptable to have, like, someone outside of your relationship, out of your marriage. And I don't like that. I'm not, like, we are not sharing this. This is not a communal activity. And so for me at least, that's one of the issues that I have with dating. And it's also one of the things that I had to be, like, very clear about. Fortunately with Juju, we are both on the same page of that we don't want to do that. But I do think it's something that, to a certain degree, they're like, "Oh, you're so American." No, I'm not so American. I just believe that the relationship should stay between the two of us. I don't want to take a lover, like, and I would prefer you not to have a mistress, right? So that's it's kind of one of those things that I think is the biggest thing that I just don't like, and you definitely have to make sure you address it very quickly, very early on, and make sure that both of you are very clear on that, because from their culture, not that big of a deal. Okay, so here are some of the biggest differences between dating in France versus the US, and I just kind of want to share them with you because they are definitely things that really surprise me. So one is that they move in with each other very, very quickly here. I'll never forget, I was walking past this cafe that I used to go to constantly, and I was talking to the guy there, and he said to me, I was telling him, "Oh yes, I'm dating someone." He goes, "Well, did you guys move in together?" And I said, "No." And he goes, "Oh, well then, you're not in a relationship." In the US, there's, like, a whole conversation usually about that, but people don't just, like, give up their housing and just move in together. But in France, you do. Part of that, I want to note, though, is due to the apartment situation. It is easier to get an apartment when you have two people who are getting that apartment and they're in a relationship. It's also easy. You can also tend to get a bigger apartment. So, you can level up. Instead of being each in two tiny apartments, you both can get, like, one normal sized apartment. So that is part of the reason that people do it. But culturally, people just move in with each other very, very quickly here. And that for me is just, that for me really threw me. But yes, people move in together very, very quickly here. That's when you're in your relationship officially, once you're living together. We had to have a musical interlude for Juju to come in and give me kisses. Okay, so back to talking about the differences between dating in France versus America. To me, it's very unique about French culture is that very quickly people find themselves, like, having children together, and they may not have even been dating for very long or in a relationship for very long, and they're having a child together. And sometimes they will later on get married, and then other times they just won't. I cannot tell you the number of times I see people planning weddings and they already have 2 or 3 kids together. It's something that I think is very, very interesting, and it's I think in America, there's still some cultural stigma associated with that, whereas in France, that there is no cultural stigma associated with that, really whatsoever. And there is this structure called PACS that exists in France, and it basically gives you the same rights of being married, but without having to like go through the all the steps of getting married. And the thing is, it's actually used a lot by young people who don't believe kind of in the institution of marriage. They don't believe in the concept of like standing before God and all of that sort of stuff. So they just do a PACS, PACSA, and it's a civil union essentially. That's the best way I think to describe it. And yeah, they do that, and then they just have a whole bunch of kids together. they literally just like never get married. So it's something that I think is very, very interesting about the culture here. Another thing that I would say is also very different, a big comparison to dating in the US, is that age doesn't make a woman less desirable in terms of dating. So I see a lot of older women with younger men. And that is something that I find to be really interesting, because I think it's very much the reverse in the US, where you see older men with a lot of younger women, but not so much in France. That's not really something that's weird for an older woman to be with a younger man. I mean, look at the president. Now, I do want to touch upon some of the annoying qualities, I would say, that exist about dating in France versus the US, because I don't want to make it seem like it's all rainbows and sunshine, because there are definitely like downsides to that. So one I already kind of mentioned is because there aren't really the traditional gender roles. As a result, you can at moments find yourself having disputes over things that to me are just annoying. Like, to me, just take out the trash, right? Like that to me is just, is not a huge request. But again, because traditional gender roles don't exist here, that becomes a thing that I just, like, you end up in these weird debates. It's like, why? Another thing I would say that drives me crazy about dating in France versus America is that when you have an argument or a dispute, you find yourself in a position where you are debating the meaning of a word. Oh, no. This word does not mean this to me. It means this. And you're like, well, it means this in the English language dictionary, and we're speaking English. Well, that's not what it means in French. So then we need to be having this discussion in French if you want to use the French definition. Well, there are multiple definitions for that word in French. Oh my gosh. It's like arguing with Merriam-Webster. I'm using definition number 4 of this word instead of definition number 1. You find yourself doing that a lot in relationships here, where it can be, you're just having this really ridiculous like tension, and you first got to debate the meaning of the words before you can then get to the substance of what it is you're trying to actually get to, and that drives me crazy about Frenchmen. Another thing that will happen, and this is something that also happens in the US, is that they will want to talk with you on the dating app, and then they'll just like never ask you out on a date. That happened to me. I don't know if part of that had to do with the fact that it was during the COVID period, and so people were in their hometowns and then coming back to Paris, and it may have had something to do with that. But no matter what, I don't give a flying flip. That drives me crazy. I hate when a guy wants to talk, and then you never go on a date. So for me, I'm really big on being like, yeah, no, not talking to you anymore. So a lot of times you're thinking you're about to go on a date with someone who speaks English, and they don't. I ended up going on this date with this guy, and we went to the grocery store, because during that time you could meet at the grocery store. Like that was like one of the few places you could go. And I'll never forget, we arrive and he goes, "Can we speak in French?" And I said, "No, I don't speak in French." I was very clear, like, I need someone who speaks English. And he was like, "Okay, you like chocolate?" I'm sorry, sir, what? And I remember I told him, I said, "I don't think this is really going to work because you don't speak English." And he goes, "I speak English." And I said, "Okay, you speak English. Okay, well, I'm not talking to you again." So there's that. Another thing that's really annoying, kind of on that same vein, is they don't really seem to understand or have that much empathy for like the stress that comes with being in this country as a foreigner when you don't speak perfect French. You know, just the bureaucracy of it all. They're so used to and accustomed to the bureaucracy that it doesn't really faze them, I think, a lot of times. Whereas for us as Americans, we don't have that level of bureaucracy, right? Our only bureaucracy is our taxes. So as a result, it just becomes exhausting. It can result in tension, let me assure you. Also, in the same vein of some of the other things I've talked about that I find annoying would be kind of their brutal honesty. So they will be brutally honest when it comes to things, particularly when it comes to your looks. So for example, let's say you're a little bit heavier. They are probably never going to tell you something like, oh, you should lose some weight, but they may say something like, I wouldn't mind if you lost weight. And that's gonna sting a little, right? Because our whole thing as America is, you know, you accept me how I am and da-da-da. They're accepting you, but maybe they're not fully, but they wouldn't mind if you changed yourself a little. They wouldn't mind if you lose a few extra pounds. I, once had Juju even once said to me something like, oh, you picked up a little weight there. And I was like, listen, we're not talking about this body here. Because I'm looking at your body and you've picked up some weight too, and you don't see me grabbing your little chunks of fat, do you? And he was like, no, you don't, and I have picked up weight and I'm trying to lose it. I was like, okay then, we don't do that in this household. We're not going to do that. And they also have like these weird relationships with food. Like in French culture, it's really acceptable to kind of like starve yourself at times. And I don't do that. I'm gonna eat my food, and so there definitely have been times when he's like, oh, well, you shouldn't eat that. I'm like, don't comment on what I'm eating. We're not doing that thing. Like, I get that you all are all trying to stay thin, and so you have some sort of weird eating disorder that exists as a cultural basis. However, that is not me. Do not do that to me. So there are these things that they do where they can be brutally honest on things like that, and at least for me and my American sensibilities, it's not cool. Last but not least, I really want to talk about the French views on intimacy, particularly sex. So, and I've saved this for last because I think that this is one of the biggest preconceptions that Americans likely have of French people, is that they're just so free with their bodies and they're, hooking up everywhere, and they just have these very, open views on intimacy, right? They 100% have a very different view on intimacy than we do as Americans. It is definitely, I would say, less quote unquote prudish. You can, be intimate with someone on the first date. And it's not going to be a thing. Because of that cultural perspective, they do expect, plan on, anticipate being intimate a lot sooner. With that said, unlike in the US, where I felt almost like it was kind of being forced, like they were trying to assess it very quickly in, when you're dating, in France, if you're like, you know what, I'm not down with that, or I want to wait, or whatever, you don't really get pushback from the guy. He's like, okay, ça va. So I'll give you an example from a date that I went on in Washington, D.C. So I'm a person of faith, and I always have put that on my dating profiles. And I went on this date with this guy, and he started talking about my faith, and I was kind of like, okay, like, where's this going? It became very obvious very quickly. What he was asking was, how long am I going to have to wait before we can have together? And I was just kind of like, this is interesting questioning that you're giving to me, sir, on the very first date. And that sort of thing happened to me all of the time when I was in the US. Whereas living in France as an American, I have heard countless stories from American women who said, who told their partner, I'm not comfortable with like being intimate that soon, and I'd like to wait longer. And one woman I know about, she even said, I want to wait until I'm married. And these men, like, were just so cool about it. They were so chill. And I think that that's something that's quite interesting, and that's very, very different than what I found in the US, where it was all about how soon are we going to do this, and let me figure out, how soon you're going to be down. Whereas here it's like, assume that you're going to do it, but if you don't want to, like, okay, fine. How do you have a society and a culture that's so much more open about sex and intimacy, and yet at the same time is so much more respectful of the boundaries that you might place upon it? And again, everything I've said here, these stories, these examples, everything I've talked about, this really has been based upon not just my experience, but also observations I've made of other friends who are dating in France or who are getting married, etc., all of that. So obviously it's based on a sampling. It's obviously there are always going to be exceptions to that rule. I am certainly not saying French men are perfect. I am certainly not saying, you can always expect to find teddy bear here. I'm not saying any of those things. I'm just saying that from my observations, from watching my friends, from listening to my friends talk about their experiences and seeing my friends' friends and Juju's friends and all of that, there are some interesting cultural approaches to dating and relationships that I think are just very, very different from America, and in many ways, for me at least, are more open, more free, less judgmental, and also less toxic. Okay, so there you have it. I hope you've enjoyed this video on the differences between dating in France versus dating in America. Please feel free to let me know if you have any questions in the comments or any comments that you want to add. I would love to hear if you have any stories to share, like your observations or whatnot, because obviously, as I said, mine is based on my experiences, plus, those of some of my friends and that whatnot. So obviously, you're dealing with only a certain amount of people, but everyone has a different experience, and I would love to hear that if you want to share, if you feel comfortable sharing. Thank you for being patient with me with my cold. I know that I probably sound congested. I've taken many breaks in filming this to blow my nose, so thank you. So with that said, thank you so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Talk to you later. Bye.